Hayfield. Would now like to welcome you all to the presentation by Kevin Anderson, Professor Kevin Anderson, entitled COP26, What the World Needs Now and What We Can All Do. Kevin is a Professor of Energy and Climate Change at Manchester University and a former director of the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research. He's an engineer by training and background. He's published widely on this subject in a host of prominent publications and has worked across tiers of government, both in the UK and in the EU, and contributed to the development of the UK's Climate Change Act. He's authoritative, well-researched, and on his previous presentation in Hayfield, now 5 or 6 years ago, provided both a challenging and proved both a challenging and inspiring speaker. As one who's been monitoring my own carbon footprint for the last 2 years or so, and having managed to reduce our household footprint to now 7 tonnes annually, which is about half the UK average, I'm aware of some steps that one can take without too much pain to reduce one's footprint, but I'm looking forward to hearing about other thoughts that there might be about further steps that one can take. It may well be that you've got in the course of the presentation questions and points that you'd like to raise. Could you please use the chat function at the bottom of the screen? And I understand that Kevin is prepared to be interrogated, so to speak, or to be interrupted in the course of the presentation if there's some matter which is raised which is pertinent to something he's just said. So I think without further ado, it's my very great pleasure to welcome Kevin Anderson, who will talk, I understand, for around about 50 minutes or so, 50 minutes. Thank you, Kevin.
Okay, that's fine. Right at this moment, though, I can't share my screen. Have I been given hosting rights?
Kath, have you given hosting rights to Kevin?
Your mic's off, Kath.
Kath, can you give Kevin hosting rights?
Ah, it looks like I've got something there that I recognise now. Let's hope that's the one.
Looks good.
Right, can you see that? Okay, can you?
Yes.
Let's put it onto. So is that coming across now in slideshow mode?
Looks like it. I've lost your slides left-hand side. I've got your screen full screen now.
Yeah,
I've got
your full screen. Yeah,
full screen. Yeah.
Okay, grand. Let me just move a couple of more things. Shift that down to there. Yeah, that should be fine there. Right. Well, thanks very much for the introduction. I hope I've hit the right note for this evening, and certainly some of you who are, I think it was at the Royal the last talk some time ago. There'll be some of the slides that look quite familiar because some things haven't changed, but other things have changed. So I hope I've hit the right note tonight. And then what I'm going to do is go through my sort of interpretation of where we are on climate change, our commitments, and how far we are away from meeting them or are towards meeting them. And then towards the end, pull it together. So what we need to do, the scale of the challenge that we face, and what that might look like in terms of some sort of practical changes that we can think about delivering. But I've called the talk, I always change my title, so I apologize for this, but I've just used this title for this front slide, From Iniquity to Integrity. And I think iniquity captures quite well, I think, where we've been on climate change for far too long, but certainly for 10 to 20 years. And it's quite an immoral position. That's immoral behavior and immoral position. I think that's what we've held, certainly collectively. For a decade or two, particularly the wealthy parts of the world who've been responsible historically for most emissions, and increasingly some of the sort of transition economies as well. But if we're going to solve climate change, we need to move from that iniquity to a position of integrity. Look at the slides to download. There we go. So the subtitle, this is COP26, and how do we deliver on our climate commitments? And I think probably because many of you in Sustainable Hayfield, you'll be quite familiar with a lot of the terrain. So hopefully some of this stuff is just things that you already know. If there are any concerns, please, I can't actually see anyone, but if you speak out, if you put yourself on, unmute yourself and just say, look, can you explain that a little? Then I'm very happy to do that. Or if I'm speaking and it's not very clear.
I think, Kevin, we've asked everybody we've muted everybody, save for one or two of us. So we're using the chat function.
Okay, that's great. Yeah. Yeah. So if they just put it in the chat, then you can interrupt. That's fine. Yeah. Grand. Anyway, I'm going to start off somewhere well away from climate change in some respects, anyway, with the banking crisis, which probably, when I talk to my students, they often they don't even know about the banking crisis because they were too young. But I'm guessing with Sustainable Hayfield, that's probably not the case. So probably most of you there are aware of the banking crisis. So 2006, I think it would be fair to say the sort of general view was that rapid social change is impossible. The public will never accept it. Then we had 2007, we had the subprime mortgage scandal in the US, and that triggered this, well, pretty much a global banking crisis. It was very much, well, in some respects, it was much wider and deeper than the 1930s depression. 2008, we had began this decade of austerity, hitting, of course, the poorest communities, but huge cuts in public services, massive job insecurity, huge social upheaval for many. And of course, this has been ongoing. And we also had, of course, this concept of quantitative easing, so QE, where these massive transfers in the UK, probably roughly maybe £500 billion, moved from the public's realm, from the public money, from the state into the private sector. And the idea was it would stimulate spending. And you might make arguments one way or another that was successful or not, but it certainly didn't help. It wasn't earmarked for green type projects, which it could well have been. And in fact, some parts of the world did do that, for instance, Korea and China. But what I think is interesting there is that we went from the impossible to the deliverable in 2 years. So what was absolutely impossible, you couldn't imagine it, you'd have been laughed out of the park in 2006, we were doing in 2008. And then what have we just been through now? We're this deep, well, not been through it yet, we're still partly in it, this deep COVID tragedy. And again, you go back to 2019, rapid social change is impossible, the public will never accept it. 2019-20, COVID triggers a global response, and we've all lived through this, we're all very familiar with this now, lockdowns, rapid mobilization of science and tech. I think that's quite interesting. Go back to the early 2020, and what you would have heard was sort of discussions that the vaccines will be a few years away and so forth. And yep, in 6 months we had various vaccines being tested. Within 12 months we started rolling them out. So I think it's just interesting how rapidly things could change. And also what happened there is we started to realize the value of our key workers. They were particularly poorer people, disproportionately people of color, and of course, disproportionately impacted by by COVID, by the COVID virus. But we went from this position whereby we couldn't possibly impose rapid social change, but overnight we did exactly that. And there's much wider acceptance now that we may have to do something similar in more sort of selected geographical zones out across the next few years. I think it's just worth just stepping back quickly on COVID, because obviously a lot of people have thought about, well, we had big reductions in emissions, just to give a flavor of what they looked like. So if we played COVID out over 2020, then we saw globally about reductions of about 6 to 7% per annum. I think the UK was near 11%, so most of the wealthy countries were a little bit higher. And it is all interesting as well that if you carried on that sort of level of cut at a global level, year on year on year, then that would take you somewhere near the 1.5 to 2 degrees C framing of climate change that's embedded in the Paris Agreement. So it just gives you a sense of the ongoing reduction rates that we would need to deliver. And obviously, COVID was not a climate change event, but it does give us a flavor of that, of the scale of the challenge that we face. As a prelude, so all of this was really a prelude. All of these changes has been a prelude to this language of climate emergency, which we hear. This is Nicola Sturgeon talking about it in Scotland. You can see it in Northern Ireland. You can see it in Wales. You see it in the UK. And of course, you see it across the EU. But now you're seeing it much wider than this. The language of climate emergency has been used by Biden in the US. It's a widely used expression now within companies, within organizations and institutions. And so the language of climate emergency has almost become sort of part of our daily discourse. It's widely declared. And so in this climate emergency, and given that we've lived through in the last 15 years, 2 rapid shifts in how society responds to things, what's our response here? Well, we're in a climate emergency. We're seeing no sweeping or rapid social change. We're seeing no immediate or widespread penetration of low carbon technology. Certainly there's some more renewable energy, but it's plus oil, gas and coal. It's not instead of. not at a collective level. We're seeing some electric vehicles rolled out, and I hold my view on that. At the moment, I'm not certain whether they're necessarily, certainly the way we're doing it, I think there are some problems with them. But anyway, we're seeing some EVs rolled out, but they are in addition to petrol and diesel cars. And actually, if you look at the sale of SUVs, sports utility vehicles, these sort of huge, ridiculously heavy things that some people seem to insist on driving, that these sorts of vehicles are completely outselling EVs. We're seeing improvements in efficiency, but it's going alongside more consumption. So really what we're just seeing is some changes, but they're not substituting for our high carbon lifestyles. And during all this, what's emerged is this concept of net zero by 2050. So that should say net zero 2050 there, which I think you're probably all going to be fairly familiar with that language of net zero 2050. And it's pretty much been a ubiquitous response across the UK and much wider now. I mean, and many other parts of the world are using this language of net zero. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time unpicking it, but it's a relatively new expression. It wasn't there 5 years ago, or barely spoken about by anyone. And I've been deeply concerned about it. I see net zero means not zero in my view. And I'm going to use that to frame so the next 10 minutes of the slides, I think. So the question I would ask then is net zero an appropriate response to the climate emergency that we're actually facing? Well, I've called this a bit about the science, but in fact, there's no science here. I'm just making the obvious statement. And in fact, I took this from a talk I gave recently to a group of lawyers. So I was asked to talk about climate change with this group of lawyers. And I've just pointed out to them from a science point of view, the climate does not respond to good intentions, to Machiavellian policies, to eloquent arguments, to legal niceties, or accountancy scams. All of these are trumped by the brutal beauty of the physics. And the physics tells us very clearly it's the total quantity of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that we dump in the atmosphere that relates to temperature. And I think for me, this is quite pertinent, this slide, having spent last week in Bristol, I spent literally the whole week arguing why, on a climate change perspective at least, Bristol should not be looking to expand its airport. And yet what I'm having to hear from the other side, from the developer, from Bristol Airport Limited, is all sorts of Machiavellian policies, eloquent arguments, legal niceties, and other forms of maths that are only just falling short of accountancy scams. And so actually, when you look at it, airport by airport is doing this. The same sort of arguments are being made for the coal mine in Cumbria at this moment, which has been looked at. And the UK government is using this in other parts of the world, in other parts of the UK, to support ongoing shale gas production or development rather, and ongoing oil gas production and new fields indeed. So the science does not respond to any of this. It sees through it all. I also want to add a bit of humility to where we are today. And I would have used a slide very similar to this before. The first IPCC report came out in 1990. And as I point out to many of the students, that's before their parents met. So it is a long time ago now, 31 years ago now. And yet in 2019, emissions are up over 60%, I think about 62% in 1990. And they dropped, as I said, in 2020. And this year, they're thought to be just slightly below what they were in 2019. So we're pretty much back to where we were pre-COVID. They were still rising in 2019, up by just a little over 0.5%. And so the comment I repeatedly make is that we've had 30 years of really what's been abject failure in terms of reducing our emissions. Now, that doesn't mean to say that people have tried, but collectively, I think it is important to recognize we've failed. And I always sort of say here that before we progress from that point, I think it's often worth just sort of stopping and reflecting on that however hard people have tried here, there, and everywhere, overall, collectively, we have failed for over 30 years to reduce our emissions. And I think reminding ourselves of that and then sort of putting our shoulders back and say, well, we've got to change and move away from that. That helps us, I think, recognize we have to think differently about these challenges. Our failure is an important part of how we consider the future. But the language we hear, and of course you'll hear this in pretty much every country you go to, or every company you go to, or every institution you go to, about how well that particular one is doing. So we hear in the UK, isn't the UK showing leadership? And I work in Sweden quite a lot, and it says it's just the same thing. And indeed, I work part of the time in Norway, and they say the same thing as well. In 2018, according to these reports from the Committee on Climate Change and their reports, at least their recommendations, the headline recommendations have been now enshrined in law. In 2018, we were 44% lower emissions than we were in 1990. In 2020, we were 51% lower than 1990. But if those numbers exclude international aviation and shipping, which grew considerably, which has grown considerably since 1990. They also excludes imports and exports, and that's an important part because we've offshored quite a lot of our manufacturing. So really, I would suggest we've seen no real leadership in the UK. What we've actually seen, if you play out the numbers, and I just checked this again recently, we've seen now about a 15% reduction since 1990. So that's about 0.5%, just under 0.5% every single year. But that's the same for other so-called climate progressive countries. You know, Denmark, Sweden, France, the EU. None of these are any better. So the UK is not an outlier here. Pretty much all of the so-called climate progressive parts of the world have failed. Certainly, industrial climate progressive parts of the world, and other places are much worse. You look at Norway, look at Ireland, look at the US. And is it too much of a surprise? You know, here's the Clare Ridge field, BP's Clare Ridge field that got the go-ahead. I think it was in 2019 for phase 2. Planned emissions 250 million tonnes over the next 25 to 30 years. We looked at the Glengorm gas field that was only from last year. Just beginning of last year, 100 million tonnes of carbon dioxide in that gas field. East Yorkshire, the one near Hull, and it's the biggest onshore field for a long time, about 13 million tonnes of CO2 will be coming out of that. The UK government, despite the fact it said it's not investing abroad, it's not the case. In fact, I'm involved in a legal case now against the British government because it's pumping £1 billion, £1 billion of UK's tax money into this huge liquefied natural gas facility in Mozambique. And it is not for the Mozambicans, it's for exports. It's already got contracts with Centrica. If you play out the emissions that are estimated, play out the size of the reservoir estimated by Total, who are the operator there, it's about 4 billion tonnes of CO2. And I think really the UK government's own oil and gas authority, if you look at their website or their Twitter account, indeed their homepage, it gives the lie to the appropriateness of net zero. You know, net zero is simply the wrong tool for the job here. This is the front page of the website. We work with the industry and government to maximize the economic recovery of UK oil and gas and support the UK government in its drive to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. So we're maximizing our production of fossil fuels, whilst at the same time claiming we're going to meet our net zero 2050 target. It just shows you how the net zero 2050 target can be made to fit anything that we want. The coal mine in Cumbria this week, one of the claims is by the developer that it fits within the net zero framing for the UK. And anything, I would argue, that can be made to fit within that. And I think that lie is reinforced when we look at the UK's ongoing airport expansion. I mean, I was looking at Bristol Airport, but a whole suite of airports have already got expansion plans now. Not plans, but actually got the agreement to go ahead. And so other ones are planning it. So across the board, virtually every airport in the UK has an expansion plan. We're now going to spend another £27 billion on new roads. Though it is interesting that the Welsh government have actually used climate change as an argument as to why they're going to have a moratorium on new roads. At least that's what came out just, I think, only about a month ago. We're potentially going to open a new coal mine in Cumbria. It's quite a small one, but still, it's symbolic of our disregard for climate change. And Westminster is very enthusiastic about this new Cambo oil field. It's a very large oil field, just off to the west of Shetland. But actually, again, there's some sort of devolved hope there in that Nicola Sturgeon has actually made the comment that she wants to see whether, in fact, in any way it can be fitted within our climate change commitments. And she's implying that it probably can't. So there's some hope perhaps in some of our devolved administrations. In isolation, all of these carbon profligate developments are said to be compatible with net zero by 2050. And that's part of the problem, is that anything in isolation can be said to fit with net zero. And I'm going to try and explain why that is and how that's the case. But I think it's first worth stepping back and what is it we have actually committed to deliver? Well, if we go to the Paris Agreement, which obviously you'll all be familiar with, 2015, at the Paris Agreement, we agreed to cut our emissions in line with staying well below 2 degrees centigrade and ideally pursue 1.5, to do this in accordance with the best science and on the basis of equity. And it's worth bearing in mind that these temperature changes in a cold, well, it's a quite nice day today, but on an often cold day in Hayfield, these don't sound too bad. But these as global average temperature changes, these are absolutely huge. Now, the idea that we heat up the globe, the atmosphere by 2 degrees centigrade, that's a lot more energy we're putting into the atmosphere. We've only seen about 1 degree C change in all of the history of modern humans, so probably 10,000 years or so. And so that means really that we've evolved, and indeed the ecosystems around us have evolved with a pretty stable climate. And in the last few hundred years, our infrastructures have evolved like that as well. So we are broadly evolved for the climate with which we have had. And now we're talking about changes that are occurring virtually overnight from a sort of systems perspective, whether it's ecological or indeed human systems. But we said we're going to stick to these temperature rises. As I say, these are not safe. They're the best that we think we can achieve in accordance with the science, and very importantly on the basis of equity, though that is completely undermined in pretty much all of the negotiations that occur. It always comes up as a sort of rhetorical focus, but as soon as countries go back home, they pretty much ignore it. That is equity between the rich and poor parts of the world. And in May of, I think it was May of this year, we had the environment ministers of the world came together, actually, to their significant credit, came together virtually to discuss climate change in the G7 meeting. And at that G7 meeting, they made clear that they wanted to focus more on 1.5 degrees temperature rise rather than the 2 degrees temperature rise. So even more onerous than, or at least the more stringent end of the Paris Agreement. It's probably a fair way of putting it. So what does the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that's the body that brings together all the science every few years, and these are the huge reports that come out probably about every 4 or 5 years. What does that tell us about our Paris or indeed our G7 commitments? Well, if we look at the reports going back from the assessment report 5, I think it was in 2014, the SR 1.5, which was in 2018, and the most recent one, which has literally just come out this year, assessment report 6. What's clear in all of those, and they all discuss this in some detail, is that what matters in terms of temperature and thereby in terms of impacts is actually our total amount of carbon dioxide that we put in the atmosphere, our carbon budgets. So long-term targets, net zero by 2050, or even real zero by 2050, in isolation are pretty meaningless. You've got to look at the total amount of CO2 and the problem, and indeed other greenhouse gases, but primarily CO2. And I'm focusing, I should have said at the beginning, I'm focusing here mostly on carbon dioxide because it's the main greenhouse gas in terms of the levels of warming it's bringing about. And I'm focusing on energy because energy is the main source of carbon dioxide. So you can ask me later about agriculture. It's an important part of the warming. Probably 20-25% of the warming comes from agriculture emissions, but the bulk of it comes from our burning of fossil fuels. And that's my focus here. And the IPCC points out it's the total amount of carbon dioxide we put in the atmosphere. In other words, the total amount of fossil fuels that we use. And that brings the challenge from 2050 to 2040 to 2030 to 2022. It says what we do today is absolutely key. And just to give you a bit of a handle on this, this is just a stylistic. The area under the curve here, this is our emission pathway. The area under that pathway is actually the carbon budget, the total amount of CO2 we put in the atmosphere. And bear in mind with carbon dioxide, every molecule, well, every ton we put up there, well, at least a large part of that ton will be there for several hundred years, if not some of it, for a few thousand years, changing the climate. And so if we decide in the short term to expand our airports, as indeed we are doing in the UK, but then so are many other parts of the world, then it will require future generations to actually cut emissions still further. I'm going to show that won't actually be possible. So actually, it does tell us something about what our policy framework needs to be today. And based on the latest IPCC report and adjusting all the numbers to the start of next year, so January next year, and we don't want too much precision in this because there's still a lot of uncertainty around the actual details of the numbers, but it gives us all the numbers in the IPCC gives a good handle on what we need to do. But so to stay within our Paris commitments of a sort of an outside chance of 1.5 and a very good chance of staying below 2 degrees centigrade if we're moderately lucky on the feedbacks, then we have somewhere around 600 billion tons of carbon dioxide. Now, if you wanted a 50-50 chance of 1.5 degrees centigrade, which some people may argue is more appropriate, you halve that amount. So the higher the chance of getting something, the lower the carbon budget. Now, 600 billion tons to many of you probably won't mean a lot. That's from now out across the century and indeed beyond. That's a total amount of carbon dioxide that we can put in the atmosphere. In 2019, we emitted about 36.4, I think it was, billion tons from burning fossil fuels around the globe. So it gives you a flavor straight away that you're talking about 17 years of current emissions, because we're back to that sort of level now, from 2022, before globally we exceed that budget. Now, if you want to say a better chance of 1.5, you're talking about 8 years, something like that, maybe 9 years tops. So really by 2030, if we carry on as we're going today, we'll almost certainly have blown our 1.5 degrees centigrade budget. Now, why is all of this so different to net zero? This framing that we hear everywhere now, net zero, if you hear on the radio, it's always net zero. It's never zero. And if you stopped and asked the people, what do you mean by net? I think most of them would have no idea at all. So why is it so different to that? I'm not going to go into this in a lot of detail, but I just want to touch on it because I think it is important if you're going to sort of engage in what we're hearing from the media. Firstly, net zero is not based on the concept of a total carbon budget. Now, we do have short-term carbon budgets in the UK, which are 5 years long, but they're not part of a picture of what the total budget is to stay within our temperature commitments. They're just much more of a sort of a political tool to help us guide policy. The actual principal focus is actually on what we're going to do by 2050, net zero by 2050. And this is a shift. The Committee on Climate Change and indeed some of the early UK legislation was much more embedded in a sort of scientific interpretation of our temperature commitments, as we've moved away from that significantly. I mean, I disagreed with the maths and the equity part that we had before, but the overall framing, I think, was much more scientifically robust than what we have now. And what, I think I put it on sort of slightly flippantly here, that 2050 is not in my term of office. Most of the policymakers will not be there. Indeed, the scientists involved with recommending these sorts of things won't be there as well. So we'll either all be sort of pushing up the daisies or retired in Tuscany. What we're guided by instead is the whole sort of concept of highest possible ambition. That's the language that is repeatedly used that underpins the Committee on Climate Change's advice to government and indeed the government's net zero legislation. Highest possible ambition. What on earth does that mean? I mean, it's a really nebulous framing of the agenda. It's not based on some sort of quantitative assessment. And if you unpick what is highest possible ambition, you often think, well, that's not very ambitious. So it hides a lot of things that are really just much more like business as usual. It also, net zero is deeply reliant on future and planetary scale carbon dioxide removal. It's had numerous names over the years, but that's the latest term that's been used. Sometimes greenhouse gas removal, GGR as well. CDR, it captures, if you like, as an expression, it captures two ways of doing this. One is a set of technologies that are in their infancy at best, negative emission technologies, whereby we're going to find ways to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and then usually sort of liquefy it or somewhere near a liquid and then store it deep underground. And there's been a recent, in the press, I think it was just last week indeed, an example in Iceland where because they've got basalt, a particular type of rock, they can do this using the geothermal energy to capture the CO2 with a particular catalyst, and then they inject it into the rock and it mineralizes the CO2 and it does lock it away pretty securely. But you have to have lots of basalt for that. And it's worth noting that they have lots of geothermal energy there. And that plant alone you'd need 20 of those plants just to cope with the extra emissions from the expansion of a small airport like Bristol. So if you start to think we needed those at a global level, you would need tens and tens of thousands of those plants to start making any real difference. But we assume they work. In all our models, almost all of our models, we're assuming they work. And working alongside those increasingly is this thing called nature-based solutions. And who could disagree with that? It sounds really attractive, isn't it? Planting more trees. But actually, it's a much more complicated story than that. If you plant trees, you can mobilize the carbon dioxide that's locked in the soil. You can actually make the situation worse. You might affect other ecosystems and so forth. So it's not about just planting trees to absorb carbon. Great, let's plant more trees. Let's do that. Let's do it for good ecological reasons. Let's not do it just to try and soak up the carbon because we can't be bothered to put in place policies today. So these sorts of solutions, future solutions that we're going to pass on to our children to have to develop and deploy, I think are incredibly dangerous, and they're locked into net zero. And I'll come back to the minute, it's a huge level that they're locked in. Now, I'm not against these technologies. I think we should fund a big R&D program into them. In fact, we are doing pretty much in some parts of the world. So yes, let's fund research and let's deploy them if they meet very stringent sustainability criteria. And that will include social criteria as well, because some of these have big impacts on land rights, particularly of indigenous people. But we should also reduce our emissions, mitigate today, assuming that these carbon dioxide removal techniques do not work at scale. And indeed, when you talk to many of the modelers that put them in the models, they don't think they'll work at the level in their own models, but they need to have them in there to maintain business as usual, which is the sort of, if you like, the underlying core economic growth model that underpins the big scenarios that we're using to advise policy. But I think it's also worth bearing in mind that we're going to require some carbon dioxide removal. So we have to really research it and really hope that it works, because we cannot eliminate all of the greenhouse gases from agriculture. And we're going to have to carry on eating. We don't have to carry on driving cars or flying, but eating is not a lot of choice on the eating front. So even if the world became vegetarian and it was very little meat and was much more efficient in its production of food, then you're still probably talking somewhere around 6 to 10 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, mostly from nitrous oxide, fertilizer use principally, and from methane. So the combination of those two greenhouse gases means that you have to have some level of removal of CO2 from the atmosphere to compensate for the ongoing warming. But that tells us we need to have zero carbon from energy. Now, the net zero is often, in fact, I was at an event yesterday where we were talking about this in some detail with some colleagues. And one of the things that people say is attractive about it is a policy framework for all. Everyone can buy into net zero. And that some people argue is its strength. To me, that is actually its weakness, is that anything can be described as being net zero. And in fact, if you go to unpick the Committee on Climate Change's scenarios that underpin the government's policies on this, and the Committee on Climate Change are the main advisors to the government on climate change. They're not an academic organization, it's a quango, but they give advice to government. If you unpick the spreadsheets behind it and go through them in some detail, even by 2050, they're still assuming lots and lots of fossil fuel use, about 30 million tons of fossil fuel use in 2050. Just to put that in some sort of perspective, that means even if you allow for increase in population in the UK, the emissions per CO2, the CO2 emissions per person in 2050 are assumed to be as high as that of a typical Kenyan person today. So we've still got a lot of CO2. And it's assumed that after 2050, they will carry on across the century, gradually coming down, but for a long time to come. And somewhere between 0.5 and 750 million tons of CO2 is expected to be emitted from the UK from burning fossil fuels after 2050. So is this net zero? It's certainly not what most people think of as zero, still putting out 500 million tons or more. It assumes planetary scale uptake of carbon dioxide removal. And in fact, if you prorated it, I think what's interesting there, the level of absorption of CO2 from the atmosphere, if you prorated the UK's position up to the global level, indeed that is also captured in a lot of the global models anyway, is roughly equivalent to the total absorption of carbon dioxide through photosynthesis on the planet today. So we're assuming technology that will absorb as much CO2 as natural photosynthesis does today, which I think is a heroic and I think very dangerous and misleading assumption. And there's almost complete neglect of international equity in the UK's position, but that's not just the UK's. The UK's position is actually more robust than that of many other parts of the world, including other European countries, but it's still very, very weak indeed, in my view. So how far is the UK away from delivering on its Paris commitments? Well, if this is some work from a paper that some colleagues and I had published last year, and if the rest of the world failed as badly as the UK does, and I say the UK is probably, of the industrialized countries, is probably doing slightly better than quite a few of them and about the same as the other more progressive ones, then you'd be talking about 2.5 to 3 degrees centigrade of warming, not 1.5 to 2. So far, far removed from Paris. And I often sort of describe that as much more like living on a different planet. That's a huge shift in the energy balance of our planet and therefore how our ecosystems operate, and indeed human systems as well. So what I want to start to do now is to lay out what is the scale of the challenge in terms of reducing emissions, and then touch on what are the sort of things that we need to see changing and how rapidly. So I'm looking here at sort of G7 and Paris, 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade, and going back to the sort of the illustration I've used for quite a lot of years now, and I may well have used this last time. If we think of our carbon dioxide emissions as a sort of total global pie of CO2, then for a low chance of 1.5 and a very good chance of 2, we're talking about 600 billion tons. Now, as I say, it could be a bit higher than that, 20% higher or 20% lower, or if you wanted a much better chance of 1.5, then half of that budget. But it gives us a flavour of what it looks like. But we also, sorry, I have to think where I was going with that then. We're also committed to divide that pie up with a real consideration of equity. And this has been embedded in every international negotiation back to 1992. So every year we say that the poorer parts of the world should have longer to make that transition away from fossil fuels than the wealthier parts of the world. And the language that's used in the Paris Agreement is developing country parties and developed country parties. So if we use the language that's embedded in Paris that at least the signatories signed up to, then what we did in the paper was to say, well, how would you make that split between them? So you can see the sort of slice of the pie taken out here for developed versus developing. And it's about 80% of the global population is in the developing country parties and about 20% in the developed country parties. And then we asked the question, and the slice would vary depending exactly how you split that pie up. And we did have quite a wide range of options for doing that. And then we looked in the developing country parties, and we wanted to focus in on the UK and say, well, how much should the UK get? And again, there are different ways to divide up the pie that give you some different results, and I'll share the results in a minute. But we've also done this sort of work for other countries. We've taken it down to regional levels, like Greater Manchester Combined Authorities have asked us to do that for Andy Burnham. We've carried the same sort of analysis for a number of other councils in the UK and a few others around Europe, and quite a lot in Sweden now. You can also take it down to a sector. Now, each time you downscale it, you have more uncertainties, but it gives you again for a flavour for those sectors as to what it looks like. But for the UK, in terms of numbers, we have, from the beginning of 2022, somewhere between 2 and 3 billion tonnes of CO2 that we can emit into the atmosphere, depending on how you split this pie up along all these different stages. So there's quite a large range there, except for when you look at that, that's 5 to 7 years of current emissions. So it's still massively challenging, whichever number you take, and no doubt policymakers always want the bigger one. Whichever way you take it, it's going to be just hugely challenging. Current emissions, 7 years. Now, if you just drew a straight line from today to zero in say 14 years, then that would take us to, that would be fine if we did that straight line down from where we are today, which is probably about somewhere heading towards 380 to 400 million tons, take that straight down to zero in say somewhere like 2035, 2036, then that would be about right. But this is an emergency situation, and we think we should really treat it like the emergency that we claim it is. And if you play out those numbers, which really just come from some basic arithmetic from the science, without all of the various techniques that have been used in the net zero framing to undermine this, well, it's well over 10% per annum mitigation. And that's if you started today. But given that it'll take you a few years to reach that sort of level, that's what we reached last year in COVID, but this year we're back up significantly. Then you're really talking about total reductions of emissions from the UK compared with 2019, not compared with 1990, and bear that in mind when you see a lot of the comparisons. Compared with very recent emissions, we're talking about a 3/4 cut in our total emissions by 2030. So in 8 years from now, there or thereabouts, 3/4. And that sounds almost impossible. We should have started earlier. We didn't. So we're reaping what we didn't sow, if you like. And that's zero carbon energy. If you play out a bit further, zero carbon, not net zero, real zero, by 2035, there or thereabouts. Again, it could be a few years either way. For the wealthy parts of the world, typically it's between 2035 and 2040. For the wealthier countries within the wealthier group, so the UK, Germany, and so forth, then the US, Japan, Australia, they're probably going to be the earlier of those years. But if it was Poland or Portugal, you think it may be nearer sort of 2040, but that sort of range. And the poorer parts of the world, which I'm not focusing on here, they're nearer sort of 2050, 2055, that sort of time frame for them. But they still have to peak their emissions and still come down quite rapidly. Now, if you play this out, this is immediate and profound system change. This is a huge shift in the agenda from anything we're prepared to discuss at the moment. And I want to start to pull this together now, bringing this concept of equity into this within our national boundaries as well as within our international boundaries. That's why you can hear the bubbling of my bottle as I'm drinking the water there. So there's one equation in this talk, and it's this equation that I've used quite a lot of times. It's Paris plus the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So basically Paris plus science equals equity. And I think regardless of our moral position, whatever that might be, I don't think there's an easy way out of this. If we want to meet our Paris or G7 commitments of staying well below 2 degrees centigrade and ideally aiming for 1.5, and if we want to combine that with what our best science tells us, then equity comes out as an inevitable and significant part of the response that we have to make. And yet it's pretty much ignored between countries, and it's also ignored, I would argue, within countries. And some of you will have seen, I think last time I used this slide as well, but there's been a recent paper by Stephen Carter that just reinforced this is where we are still. CO2 is highly skewed towards a relatively few people. If you look at the sort of global distribution of this compared with our income deciles, you see the sort of shape of this curve. It's quite a famous plot now. It comes out of some excellent work in 2015 by Lucas Chancel and Thomas Piketty, but it's been redone by a number of colleagues around the globe since then. Judith Steinberg's done some work on this, and more recently, say, Stephen Carter's work. But about half of global emissions come from 10% of the population. And of that 10%, about 3/4, so 2/3 of that 10% live in the wealthy parts of the world, and about 1/3 in the poorer parts of the world. About 70% of global emissions come from just 20% of the population. But I think, and this comes out of Sivan's most recent work, the top 1% of global emitters emit twice as much carbon dioxide as the bottom 50%. So you took half of the global population, the top 1% emit more than twice as much as that bottom half. I mean, that is such a telling and damning figure. And that should, in my view, be significantly colouring our policy landscape and should be informing COP26. It's nowhere to be seen. No one ever likes these sort of numbers that tell us who is responsible for the lion's share of the emissions. And perhaps we can come back to that a little bit later. Certainly an argument you often hear, well, does this huge asymmetry or imbalance in emissions, does it really matter? You know, there's so many people out there, even if they're emitting a little, surely that's what matters. And a quick thought experiment, which I may have used last time, I can't remember now, but the numbers still hold. If climate change was considered a serious issue, if we thought it was a climate emergency, and we then put in place regulations to require the top 10% of global emitters in whichever countries they were to reduce their footprint, their carbon footprint, to the average of a European citizen. So it's not that impoverished. The average European lives a pretty reasonable life. And the other 90% of the global population made no change to their behaviors or no reductions in their emissions. Then that alone would come to about a 1/3 cut in global carbon dioxide emissions. And I think it just shows how hugely skewed the emissions are to the activities and lifestyles of a relatively few of us. And it's not everyone in the wealthy parts of the world, as people often say. That misunderstands it, but it's a significant proportion of people in the wealthy parts of the world that are in this group. But I think it's probably, I said before, I think it's not far off, about 1/3 of the wealthy parts of the world. So I'm going to start using this and using science before this. I'm going to try to start to pull some of this together and draw some sort of conclusions. They're quite lengthy conclusions, though. First, I think for wealthy countries, particularly for so-called developed countries, I'm never quite certain that's what we really are. But anyway, for this wealthier parts of the world, I think the choices between a preference really to ignore international equity, to pass a huge burden onto our children in terms of responding to climate change, to be part of a 2.5 to 3 degree C future, and by doing so, renege on our Paris and G7 commitments. But the benefit of that sort of framing is that it dovetails with today's politics. It allows us to maintain the current economic market model and just to really have significant, but nonetheless incremental adjustments to business as usual. So it's a world we recognize, a financial world, an economic world that we recognize around us today. Then that's fine. Choose 5% per annum mitigation and net zero by 2050, and just hope our children will understand that we didn't want to do anything better. If instead our preference is to take international equity seriously, then we have to have a huge mitigation effort by this generation. We have to cut emissions in line with our well below 2 degrees centigrade, ideally aim for 1.5, and thereby abide with our Paris commitments. But to do that requires a massive ramp up in government intervention. Now, okay, I'm not saying everything's got to be done by government, but it needs to put a framework, an umbrella framework, a policy framework that drives the private sector as well to reduce its emissions in line with the emission pathways for 2 degrees centigrade. And that's going to require a complete reshaping of current economics. But you can argue, is that such a big deal? We had the banking crisis and then COVID. If we haven't gone through any, the one thing we have gone through, despite the COVID tragedy as well, but the other thing we've gone through, of course, is a rapid reshaping of our economics over the last, since 2007, pretty much now, with those two particular issues. So perhaps now is a good time to reshape our economics. And we need immediate and deep cuts across all sectors. There are no exceptions to this. And this is more like 10 to 20% per annum mitigation every year at a collective level and real zero by 2035. But bear in mind, as I pointed out before, this doesn't mean everyone has to deliver this. Most people in the UK are already well below average emitters by definition. The average is pushed up by the high emitters in our society. And so what this requires are really significant changes by some and much more structural changes by probably the majority. Delivering on Paris and indeed G7 requires that we develop new narratives. We have to rethink what we mean by economic growth, what we mean by progress, and what we mean by development. We have to think about reframing how we value the world and value each other, and how we reward success, if we reward success, and indeed what is success, if we reward that at all. We need a much better relationship with time. I think increasingly we seem to have a focus on the now, not really taking a lot of lessons from the history, and pretty much ignoring time in the future, just discounting the impacts of our activities today on future generations, for instance. So we need to embed time more. And that takes us really towards the idea of thinking about intergenerational equity, fairness between our current generation and our children's children, but also intragenerational equity, between us and particularly the poor, climate vulnerable communities around the world who are already suffering the impacts of our ongoing emissions. And my colleague Isaac always points out it's really important to remind ourselves that actually we are part of a more than human world, and we have to have a much deeper appreciation of that more than human world. And I think that fits with this whole idea of ecological crises rather than just focusing in on climate change. So where are the catalysts for this change? This is a huge shift from anything that we're really seeing out there, certainly within the sort of official academic realm. And I think actually the catalyst that we have seen, and for me working on climate change, and I know some of my colleagues think something similar, the last 2 years have actually given a little bit more, well, certainly they've been less gloomy, let's put it that way, than the previous decade. And it's not come from the usual suspects. I don't want to put too much pressure on Greta Thunberg, but who would have thought a Swedish schoolgirl, a 15-year-old Swedish schoolgirl at the time, would have had such an impetus in changing the tone of the international debate on climate change. And the school strikes that have emerged initially from Greta as a catalyst there. She's not going to solve the problems, and she would be the first to say that, but she has helped to catalyze a wider engagement amongst the younger generations. But then we've got things like Extinction Rebellion. I don't mean to just focus in on them, but as a catch-all for a wider civil engagement, civil society engagement with issues of climate change, across the generations as well. And even things like flying, it came out initially out of Sweden, this idea of flying shame, Felicium, as it is in Swedish. And I think I prefer to see it as flying consciousness rather than shame. I'm not sure that shame is always the right way to address these issues. Sometimes it might be, sometimes not. But certainly it's flying consciousness. These are all new ways of thinking about the world that are really quite radically different from what we had just a few years ago. And actually at the same time have come out, of course, along with COVID and indeed the banking crisis. So some of these things are starting to come together. So what is it that we can do? Well, we of course we can engage with these other people out there, but my sort of 3 take-home points for what we as individuals can think about doing is first for ourselves to identify in our own lives our big carbon impacts, if you like, and try to reduce them. But in isolation, they pretty much don't matter. What matters is to try doing them and then talk about them with our friends, our family, our work colleagues. We don't bore people senseless, but at least bring it into the debate when we're down the pub and elsewhere. And you start to hear that. I mean, it's quite surprising. You sit on a train going into Manchester and you'll hear people talking about climate change now in a way you would never have heard 5-10 years ago. So engage in those debates. But we know from the psychological science that if you actually tried it yourself, then people will give you much more credibility, or you get much more credibility in terms of your views and your arguments. But be honest about it. When it doesn't work, also say that. It's not just about how easy it is. It can be how difficult it is or that it didn't work. But also engage in our place of work, our universities in my case, our councils, whatever that might be, our local media as well. So engage locally as well as just within our sort of immediate environment, and make our arguments and suggest what it is that we could do. So don't just make the arguments of why things are wrong, but how do we think it should change? What are the things that we need to be thinking about? Email our MP and the relevant minister about our concerns. And they may not all get a response, but the more emails and letters they get, the more they'll realize that could be an issue that people will vote on. Ask them about their actions. How come their actions don't meet their commitments? But also, when they do something that is good, support them. We're very good at being critical, but we're not particularly good when someone does something really worthwhile of being supportive of that. So I think we have to do both of those. Be a critical friend really across the board here.
And can I make the first intervention, Kevin, and say,
yeah, of course you can.
In that context, our MP, Robert Lagan, is apparently a net zero champion within the Conservative Party.
He is indeed, yes.
And he has a particular interest in the transport sector. So I think there's in raising matters with our MP, all of that's on the screen is entirely relevant, but he's assumed willingly that responsibility. And with that comes a measure of accountability, and it's worth reminding him of that. Whenever I write to him, I always begin by saying, as a net zero champion within the Conservative Party.
Yeah, and the more people that do that, the better. So yeah, no, I couldn't agree with him more. I think he's on the select committee, isn't he? Looking at climate change, I believe, as well.
I didn't know that.
I think so, anyway. And for COP, for the event in Glasgow in just wherever it's 6 weeks' time, these are some sort of things that I think are what's important, I'm not saying this is what's going to happen. I'd rather hope it would do, but we need to really be focusing on zero fossil fuel use in the wealthy nations by 2035 to 2040. And that is just hugely challenging, but we haven't responded appropriately, and the science just doesn't care about our failures in the past. It just tells us what we need to do to meet the commitments we've made. And so now we know pretty clearly that we need to reduce our fossil fuel use to pretty much zero by 2035 in the wealthy parts of the world, and the poorer parts will have a 15 years grace in trying to deliver that. But in between, of course, it's coming down very rapidly. You can't just wait to the final day and then stop it. So we need to, from today onwards, just rapidly bring in our emissions down, and that will roughly give us the right sort of carbon budget to stay within 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade. I think we should make sure there's no substitution of real mitigation for carbon dioxide removal. And the last two COPs, it's actually since Paris rather, these negative emissions have been directly embedded in these negotiations because it allows the policymakers to pretty much have business as usual. You take out the carbon dioxide removal and the issues become much more profound. But and worryingly, I think that will again be included, and lots of academics support its inclusion because they run scared, I think, of actually being honest to their own analysis. I think we do need a major program of R&D and potential deployment of these carbon dioxide removal techniques, but with a note that they have to meet stringent sustainability criteria and indeed social criteria. We need to see climate as just one of a suite of ecological challenges. Actually, in some respects, I think it's the easiest of ecological challenges, except for the fact it has a very strong time dimension. So it is, in my view, by far and away the most urgent, but it's probably the one that's easier to resolve than some of the other ones that are out there, which I think are much more complex to actually even understand. But we have to recognize the climate issue we're facing today is just one of a suite of these challenges that are out there. And perhaps it's just one of a series of symptoms of something, a much sort of deeper malaise in our society. We need to have huge financial transfers. I see it as reparation, not aid, to poorer nations to help them leapfrog fossil fuels. The last thing we want the poor parts of the world doing is to actually embed in their structures and their societies the infrastructure of requiring fossil fuels. So we need to help them leapfrog that. And they can also help us about how you live good quality lives with low carbon, with low fossil fuel use, because many people in these parts of the world already do that. We need strict control on the other greenhouse gas emissions as well, those from agriculture and other process emissions from industry. And I think throughout all of this, we need to find ways to honestly embed equity and fairness between nations, but also within nations. Nationally, there's some quite obvious things here. These are things that you're probably I'm pretty sure in sustainable Hayfield will be just as familiar as I am. We need an immediate moratorium on fossil fuel developments. We're not having that at the moment. The government is enthusiastically trying to pursue more fossil fuels. The only one it's slightly skeptical about is coal, and even that might go ahead. We don't know at the moment. We need a moratorium on airport expansion. We need to phase out fossil fuel use by 2035, really. And when I say phase it out, it needs to be phased out primarily earlier than that, other than the last little bits. But there needs to be a just transition in that, thinking about the people that work in these industries. So we don't do what we did to the coal industries or the coal communities. We don't decimate them. And then they have generations of suffering the consequences. We need to really think about that just transition. And to the Scottish Government's significant credit, it has had a Just Transition Commission looking at these things in detail. From 2022, we need to, well, from as soon as possible, I would say from the start of next year, that there should be no buildings constructed in the UK that do not meet at least passive house standard, and wherever possible, use on-site renewables as well. We need to retrofit our existing buildings that we expect to remain here in use for many years to come. And that's a huge agenda from a jobs agenda and a skills agenda. So there are many merits to doing that sort of thing as well, but it also helps us eliminate fuel poverty in the process. And that's 10 to 20% of homes, depending on the price of fuel at any one time. We need to move away from cars, and I would include in that EVs in our cities and our dense urban areas. So anywhere where it's sort of pretty urban and dense, then I think moving away from sort of private car travel, I think is a really positive thing. And I think EVs are just part of the problem there. The idea is going to swap our internal combustion cars for EVs locks in a whole series of environmental concerns. We need to facilitate a shift also to public and I would argue virtual transport. So a lot more use of public transport, and that can extend to things like e-bikes and all those other things as well, all the ways that we can move around with minimum resource use. A frequent flyer levy, so that we actually severely curtail aviation use in the UK and indeed other wealthy, well, all parts of the world. And that's because, at least in the near to medium term, there are no technical ways that we can get away from flying being a high carbon activity. So given it's driven primarily by frequent flyers, roughly 70% of all flights in the UK by about 14% of the population, then we need to move away from frequent flyers and much more towards people who can just fly occasionally. And that won't stop the average income family occasionally flying, but it will stop the people who are flying 5, 6, 7 more times a year. So a frequent flyer levy, a very stringent one in my view. No new fossil fuel power stations, and a huge program of electrification. About 20% of the energy we consume in the UK, what's called final energy consumption, is electricity. And we need to significantly increase that to probably 80%, if not more, as well as be more efficient in our use. So that's a massive program of electrification, way beyond anything at the moment that National Grid or anyone else is really considering. And for the final bit here, well, what about Hayfield? Well, I mean, you're going to know this terrain much more than me. So there's a few quick pointers here. Support our local shops so that we can walk to them. So they, the van brings the stuff into the local shops, and we can just walk to the local shops and get them, rather than us all driving individually to wherever we do get our stuff in Glossop or New Mills or wherever it might be. Enjoy more staycations, and I'm applying this just to myself as much as anyone else here. I need to think about these things much more. Lobby for better, or put here, less worse bus services. The bus services seem pretty poor around here as it is. Perhaps we could have more, maybe there's already something like this. I know there's some discussion around this in Hayfield, an EV car or van pool, and that you perhaps could buy into in one way or another. And I'm sure many of you here know much more about that sort of thing than I do. Lobby for ensure that all local buildings, when we are having to build new homes, if we are having to build new homes, that they are passive house and an appropriate size. I mean, it seems to me worrying that we're on a small island with a rapidly growing, still significantly growing population, and we're still building very large properties when we really should be building ones that are more appropriate to the size of the families that are living in them. A major program of tree planting, and that would be great in Hayfield, but then planting those trees not for carbon reasons, but for ecological reasons and for social reasons as well. I mean, they're wonderful things to have around us. I think most of us would agree with that. Think about retrofitting. Whenever we're doing anything to our own buildings, try to think about, well, could we retrofit our property to make it a lot more efficient than it already is, or live in it when it's much colder? One of the choice, one way or the other. And car share and lift share, those sorts of things as well. But these are just some simple pointers that I'm sure that in Sustainable Hayfield, you've got much more robust thinking around these than I have. Anyway, I'm going to finish this final slide. It's 2020, 2021. Climate change has become system change. It wasn't system change 10 years ago. It probably was 10 years. It wasn't 20 years ago. We could have done a lot of the things within the current system. But as we've failed every year, it's made it more and more challenging. Now, climate change has become system change. And as Einstein noted, or at least it's attributed to Einstein, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And I think it's particularly pertinent as we go into COP in just a few weeks' time. Thus far, we've chosen to pass on to our children the consequences of 30 years of such insanity. There are some signs that we're moving away from this, and I say they are driven not by the usual suspects, not by the academics particularly, not by the great and good, not by the policymakers, but much more by civil society. So it's people like yourselves and other people elsewhere around the planet that are providing or giving the opportunity for new narratives to be discussed. And that helps us as academics, and it helps the experts because it allows us to start to think outside of our normal sort of terrain, if you like. So on that note, thanks very much for listening.
Kevin, thank you very much indeed. What a tour de force. I'm rather pleased that the last few slides came up as they did, the things that we can do in our own lives and around our own communities. Because I remember when we had an exchange about what the talk would be entitled, you said, oh, I'd like to go with that one, what we can all do, because of its positive, upbeat nature. And I was wondering where the positive and upbeat was coming from, given your critical analysis of the wider situation. We have no one on chat. No one's raised a question, but now is the time for you to table anything that you want to. But I'll kick off if I may.
Of course, you're welcome to, yeah.
With one question. You may not know this. I don't know what your inside track is on these things, but we do know it's around the issue of equity. It was around your 6th point around, I think, expectations of COP, that there should be significant financial transfers to poorer parts of the world. Now, my understanding is that the ex-governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, is charged with a particular role in relation to this, to work on this field, and presumably in some way or other to cajole, to lever, to appeal, and perhaps to report to COP26. Now, he's a man of great experience and international authority, well placed to consider this. What's he been doing, and what prospect is there of him levering some influence?
Do you want the honest answer? That's the only one I have.
Yep.
Having listened to his, I think it was the Wreath lectures he gave this year on climate change, last year, this year, I think it was. And from my understanding of his grasp of climate change, I think he's part of the problem. He will try and lever the £100 billion that we promised initially at Paris and have failed to deliver so far. I think the Swedes are the only country that put in their relevant proportion. But £100 billion is a crumb that's falling off our tables. So a crumb has fallen off the rich countries' tables, and it's £100 billion, or $100 billion rather. And that's what we're focusing on. I mean, what are you going to do with $100 billion? I mean, it's absolute pittance. What's the size of the UK economy now? Is it a couple of trillion, something like that, isn't it?
Yeah.
So it's something like 1/20 of the UK economy that the globe is going to give, in my view, in reparation to the whole of the poor parts of the world, which is 80% of the global population, to deal with the impacts that we've imposed on them by our climate change, and indeed to help them leapfrog. It's just pennies. And he's just going to talk about pennies. And that's the problem with the status quo. It's the real trick is to get us to discuss the details of a crumb, rather than in fact is that what they require is the whole cake, or at least a large part of it. And so I think Carney and his approach, however well-meaning he may be, and I was really disappointed with the Wreath lectures, I think he's significantly part of the problem.
Okay, thank you. We now do have two or three things. To Linda Walker, who's asked the question. Yes, Linda, if you could put your question and make your point in the chat, please, we can reflect that. Thank you. To Kath Hughes, who came in quickly, can humans, a very simple, very pointed question, can humans survive a 3-degree rise in temperature?
Oh, I think certainly some people will, and we know who they'll be. They'll be rich, white in the Northern Hemisphere.
Yep.
But there won't be most of us. And so we already know that in certain parts of in parts of Florida, that some of the very wealthy there, as well as having their nuclear bunkers, are now designing their properties so they can deal with climate change. So there will be significant numbers of the population will still survive. Exactly what those numbers will be, I don't know. But I mean, I think it will be at 3 degrees centigrade. I'm sure that we will have lost significant numbers of people in our society.
And we would have also had, I guess, what we're already seeing in parts of the world, mass migrations of people from untenable environments to ones that are a little bit more accommodating.
And I think that's a really interesting point, is the migration. It's the sort of system implications. So it's not necessarily the direct implications of the temperature. It's then what do we do as human societies? Then we move. And I use as an example of this what happened when a handful of people came out of Syria. Now, they moved, obviously, because of the war there, though it was exacerbated by 12 years of drought. But significantly, people came out of Syria. And where did most of them go? They went to Lebanon and they went to Jordan. And a few came into the EU. And what did probably the most sophisticated political union in the world, the EU, what did it do? Immediately put up razor wire. It had arguments between one area and another. It disbanded Schengen pretty much. I was checked every time I got the train to Sweden on my passport as I was passing through the different countries. Almost overnight that happened, with a handful of Syrians coming into Europe. Not because of climate change. Once we see huge migrations caused by that sort of temperature rise you're talking about there, I think the social repercussions will be absolutely huge. And we have a lot of communities, of course, that have good maps, are well armed, and know how to move from A to B. You look at something like Bangladesh. There's 30 million people, half the UK population, live within 1 meter of sea level rise on the coastal strip of Bangladesh. What's just north of Bangladesh? Myanmar. Do you think they're going to welcome 30 million Bangladeshis? You can sort of see that around. So the tensions that we would be exacerbating that are already often there anyway, I think would be huge. At the same time, we're seeing all of these other stresses that climate change will impose on top of existing ones. So I think, 3 degrees centigrade, as I say, it's essentially a different world to the one in which we live today.
Okay, thank you. Dave Wells is saying, and he speaks as probably a member of the Green Party, I think, is saying, Is there one omission from your presentation? Well, there might be more than one.
I think many omissions.
But how about this one? We need to just stop measuring success by GDP growth.
Oh, yeah. I mean, what's really disturbing here, people have been saying this for absolutely years, and very seldom does anyone really disagree. I mean, GDP growth was never set up to do what it's used for now. And it's actually quite a new phenomenon in the way it's used. That, every night we get some sort of nonsense about what's happened to the growth in the UK economy over the last quarter, or what's happened to the FTSE 100 index, all this other utter rubbish. Almost no one thinks it's a good measure. It measures goods and bads. It mixes them together. If you want to increase your GDP, have a tanker accident. Always good for your GDP. Accidents are as good for GDP as are good things. So it's just a measure of activity, whatever that activity might be. So it's a ridiculous measure. It doesn't measure success. It doesn't measure progress. It doesn't measure, quality of life or any of those things. I think the Welsh are moving a bit better in their direction now. They've got the Future Generations Act, and I think it's the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act that starts to embed different ways to measure these things. Some other parts of the world are already looking at this anyway. So I think there is a big shift amongst some of the more progressive parts of the world towards alternatives to GDP. Unfortunately, we've got the astrologists, and I don't mean that pejoratively. I think it's what they are, otherwise known as economists, who are sort of framing the agenda. And it's not all economists. It's a particular school of modern market economics, neoclassical economics, who have completely, to me, have undermined almost every decent facet of our society for over 50 years. And I'm not against economists having a role. Of course, they need to have a role. I think we've got the wrong sort of economists with the wrong sort of metrics. They're fundamentally wrong in terms of climate change, but just in terms of their own remit, in terms of what is success in our society. We have, regardless of climate change, we have increasing sort of psychological stress in our society, but that goes alongside with good, improved GDP. So I think we need to unpick all of the parts of our society and measure things, if we measure them at all, measure them in the units that's appropriate for measuring them.
Okay, thank you. I know there's been a very real, in many universities, isn't there? There's been a very real challenge to that economic orthodoxy, often by students, saying this is not relevant to the world that we live in.
Post-crash economics.
Say again?
Post-crash economics. It was particularly after the crash. There are lots of economists who speak in a very different way. I mean, there's a whole swathe of ecological economists. There's other sort of slightly more standard economics, like Steve Keen down at UCL, I think is that. So the whole suite of other economists have been providing sort of different ways to look at these things. But it's I always think it's a bit like Caesar relying on tea leaves to tell him about the Ides of March. That's how economists are for our society today, and we're reluctant to let go of them for some reason. Yep.
Karen Hunt has said, and Karen will have attended your previous talk in Hayfield, which was probably about 5 or 6 years ago now, at a packed house at the Royal. Very telling question. Are you more or less optimistic than when you last spoke in Hayfield?
I don't normally like being asked whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic. I just think I sort of, in my view, I try and see it as I see it. I see it as it is. I mean, that, it's my interpretation of what it is. And I'm sort of trying to be realistic about it. I think we're going to go to hell in a handcart. I think we're going to see 3 or 4 degrees C and absolutely devastation, really. But it's not set in stone. And that's why I work in this field. Now, whether you call it optimism or not, I don't know. I just think as far as I can tell from the science does not say that we're locked into complete doom and disaster. It says the prospects are pretty slim of not avoiding it, but it does give us that slim prospect, and that slim prospect mostly is one that we can choose by cutting our emissions. And so we're not just there hopefully hoping the 5% is going to succeed. That 5% is there for us to go and get. Yep. So if we're moderately lucky on climate sensitivity, then cutting our emissions radically now, we can probably still stay below 2 degrees C-ish, which will be pretty bad, but it's much better than 3 or more. So, but compared with a few years ago, I'm more hopeful, and I'm more hopeful because of civil society. If I just had to listen to my particularly my senior academic colleagues and other great and goods in the climate world, I'll be less hopeful. But I think civil society has been absolutely key in changing the tenor of the debate, and I remain incredibly thankful for people that have done that, because for people like myself and indeed many of my colleagues, particularly the early career colleagues, I think it's opened up a space for us to have greater integrity in our thinking and our communication. So slightly more hopeful than I was.
That's very interesting. Thank you. Linda has said she's very positive about your talk and probably going to be listening to it again to catch up with the detail in it. And she's saying that she's posted details of an event taking place in on Sunday night on climate justice and racial justice, and the details are there, which she suggested she thinks would be of interest to everybody. The details are there in the chat function, so have a look at that. And she's also asking Kevin if he sees nuclear power as being essential to the increased electricity we need.
You should have asked me for a presentation on nuclear power. That's a huge question. I actually supervise, I should say at the beginning, I'm agnostic about nuclear power, and I can come explain why that is in a minute. And I should also say that I lived next door to a nuclear power station for a large part of my childhood, where my dad worked, and it was a significant part of his early death was working in the old Magnox station in Sizewell. But I remain agnostic about it. It's certainly low carbon. Even when you play out the life cycle emissions, it's very low carbon in terms of, it's actually very similar, probably somewhere a life cycle point of view of 5 to 15 grams of carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour. So it's there with the renewables. It's very expensive, takes a long time to build, and it has a huge waste legacy. And I actually supervise a PhD, someone who's incredibly enthusiastic and very knowledgeable about climate change. And we're looking at, could you seriously roll out a very large number of nuclear power stations that could make a big contribution to our energy demand? Now, in the UK, somewhere around about 3% of our energy is provided by nuclear. People always say it's 20. That's 20% of electricity, which is under 20% of our total energy demand. So nuclear is a very small proportion. And globally, it's about 2%. And so if nuclear was going to make a big difference, you'd have to have a significant rollout of nuclear power stations. Probably somewhere in the region of 50 or so gigawatts. So you're talking 50 to 100 gigawatts. So you're probably talking somewhere around about 50 big nuclear power station complexes around the UK would be necessary, somewhere like that, to provide, say, half of our energy. Do I think that's viable to do that? First, I don't think it's necessary in the UK because we have a lot of alternatives. We have a lot of wind, we have reasonable solar, we've got very good tidal, and we would have some wave as well. Wave is still in its development stages, but it has some good prospects. So I think with clever use of energy and efficiency, we could actually use renewables in the UK and pretty much not require nuclear. That would require us to deal with some of the intermittency issues which are overplayed, and I don't think are that big an issue, to be honest, because I think you can make synthetic fuel which you can use seasonally when necessary from renewables. But some parts of the world are not bestowed with the levels of renewables that the UK has, and maybe for those parts of the world, nuclear is more appropriate. So if you were to list all of the options, I always say first, do less. Second, be more efficient. Third, use the suites of renewables. That doesn't include hydro. Hydro for many parts of the world is higher emissions than coal. And then you come down to things like biomass. Well, very limited biomass that's sustainable. That's a real problem, I think, by and large. Small amounts of it are probably available. And then you come down to carbon capture and storage and nuclear. And I would take nuclear over carbon capture and storage every day of the week. But it would be the bottom of that set. And if you can meet your energy demand without nuclear, don't use it.
That's very interesting. Thank you. And your position there, I think, seems to echo that of some environmental groups, well-established environmental groups who've, shall we say, taken a slightly more measured approach to nuclear than they perhaps once did, maybe 20 years ago.
But the nuclear industry itself takes a large part of the responsibility for why a lot of people don't trust it.
Yes.
It has not been trustworthy for 50 years.
Yes. Why believe them now? Yes.
And that's a problem because there's a lot of very good people work in that industry. I have a lot of time for the people I know work in that industry, but collectively as an industry, and it's still the case in Sellafield, it's incredibly secretive.
Mm-hmm. I think it's Kath Moss has posted here to say, just can I check out something with you here? Did you say that most UK citizens or households are below the EU mean CO2 usage?
Well,
firstly, that's the first question. Are UK citizens less carbon emitting than EU citizens?
Well, I thought I'd said most people in the UK are by definition lower than the average in the UK, but they are by definition also slightly lower than the EU average because we're just a little bit below the EU average. We're very marginally below the EU average, but we are a bit. But remember, the average is pushed up by the high emitters.
Yep.
And so most people in the UK are below average emitters by definition.
Okay, thanks. There was a second question from Catherine, which says, do we know if Hayfield CO2 mean usage is above or below the EU mean? If I can help a little bit here, Kath, I don't know. There's been something produced by the Centre for Sustainable Energy called the Carbon Impact Tool, where you can look at consumption emissions by population of your parish. And we've done that. We started doing that in the parish council. And I have to say that some of the data that supports whatever the conclusion, whatever the end figures are that are produced by that tool must be highly suspect. Hayfield emerges with a huge consumption footprint, more equivalent to that of Wilmslow, one of the wealthiest places in the country, full of 4 and 5 bedroomed estate type houses. It feels like some of this isn't quite right, but the question was, is Hayfield CO2 mean? Do you know this? You don't know.
I've no idea what it is, but the nearest thing you'll get, and it's not, it's just a proxy. And like most proxies, there can be significant variations in it. The nearest proxy will be income. Income and wealth, both of them, they play out slightly differently, but income and wealth will play out there. Now, I'm guessing that Hayfield is noticeably above the UK average. I would have thought. So from a consumption point of view, unless Hayfield is particularly unusual, I'd have thought its total carbon footprint, its average carbon footprint would be higher than that of the average for the UK. But I mean, there are quite numbers there, lot of numbers there that I wouldn't be fully aware of. But yeah, I would guess that Hayfield residents on average fly more than the average UK resident. I mean, 50% of the UK population doesn't fly in any one year. Yeah. When I was campaigning, I won't say who for, but during the last election, wandering around some of the really poor flats in Glossop, these people weren't regular. These weren't frequent flyers.
No.
Hardly any ever drove. Now, we think that the average income in the UK is about £31,000, the median. In the north, it's probably somewhere in the region of 26, something like that. So, it gives you a flavour. Income gives you a reasonably good flavour of our emissions.
And the impact tool, I think, gives you a bit of a flavour as well. So if you compare us to New Mills, for example, we have a higher consumption impact, which probably feels right. Higher
gut feeling feels right. But I mean, all these numbers, they're very hard to ever get. Yeah, and someone might be a complete outlier on it as well.
Yeah, so they are. Dave Wells is just pointing us to a seminal text by Kate Raworth on donut economics, which
I know Kate. Yeah,
highly recommended as a challenging read. How things might be organised differently.
Yeah, there's also on economics there. If you want that sort of book, there's a book, I think it's 1989, by Herman Daly. Some of you may have heard of. He's sort of one of the forefathers of ecological economics, but he was also a chief economist at the World Bank, which is pretty unusual. And I think it's fair to say he's probably conservative in his politics, but it's a wonderful read. I'm saying that about his politics because it's interesting when you then read the book. And I think it's particularly it's a big book, but the first third is a pretty easy read and really tells you everything you need to know. It's very interesting how he very courteously and appropriately dismantles current forms of economics.
What's the title of that book?
It's called For the Common Good.
For the Common Good.
By Herman Daly. There's lots of other versions of it since, but I think the original version is well worth reading, the first third particularly. Okay,
thank you. We've got 5 or 6 more things. Let's see if we can crash through them pretty quickly. Roland Struby making the point that we look at our civilizations now. He refers back to past civilizations which have crashed over time. And based on those historic examples, is it possible that the total collapse of human civilization might be thought likely, if not inevitable?
I would probably tell him, I don't think it's likely, but I think it's certainly possible. If from a climate perspective, there's lots of other reasons why we might crash as well, but just from a climate perspective, there is an outside chance that we could be seeing really high temperatures. So when you look at the estimates of what the temperature might be for any given level of emissions, total emissions or atmospheric concentration of CO2, there's quite a curve with a long tail. And so when we think, well, this level of concentration in the atmosphere will give us, say, 3 degrees, there's a small chance it might give us 8 degrees. And then you're talking about complete and utter sort of devastation of everything we would know around us.
Yes.
Now, and of course, it doesn't occur overnight, but it could occur. It would occur still relatively quickly for ecosystems and everything else to survive as well.
Yeah.
And so there is a risk in the science. I mean, the science doesn't hide this. That there's an outside risk that we could be hitting even at moderate levels of concentration in the atmosphere, very high temperatures. And some scientists, people like Jim Hansen and other scientists have used completely reasonable analysis and come to the conclusion that they think that's quite likely. Others say think it's less likely, but what they all say it's possible. And so I think they might. I'm not sure about civilization. I think Gandhi was still right when he was asked about Western civilization. A very nice idea.
Yes.
Not sure we've actually seen it yet.
So put yourself in the position of Boris Johnson now, if you can, just for one day. And Penny Roberts asks, so if there's one piece of legislation, what would you choose to address this issue? One piece of legislation.
If it has to be one
presumably
piece,
would be enacted.
Oh, it shouldn't be acted. It would have. I mean, like all pieces of legislation, they never come on their own, and it would be the phase out of fossil fuel use in the UK by 2035.
Okay, that's clear. That's the point that you made in your talk.
Yeah. Michael
Corcoran making the point. DEFRA in 2018 estimated UK emissions on a consumer basis to be 702 million tonnes. Territorial emissions that year were 365 million tonnes, just over half of the total. Using this as a basis, how are we to take ownership of the other half and intervene in a manner that's compatible with the rate at which we need to achieve reductions?
Yeah. So
the difference between consumption and territorial emissions.
Yeah, a hugely important issue. First, just one thing. I think the emissions that were that year and for every year up until including now, those emissions don't include international aviation and shipping. So you probably have to add about another 40. So roughly half. Yeah. And there are different. What we know for certain for most of the countries around the world, pretty accurate anyways, is the territorial emissions, because basically we know how much fossil fuel is used because most people want to collect tax revenue from it. So we know pretty robustly how much fossil fuel is used, and we know what the emissions are per litre or meter cube, whatever the different fossil, or ton if it's coal or fossil fuel. So we know the fossil fuel data well. The problem with the consumption-based data is if I was going to get my laptop coming from China, how do I know my laptop, the aluminium in it, was smelted using coal, or was it smelted using renewable power or hydro, or did it come from ice? Yeah, so consumption-based data comes with a very high level of uncertainty, and you see this straight away as soon as you look at the consumption estimates compared to territorial. Pretty much all territorial estimates are pretty similar, for any particular country. So the different people that estimate them. But you look for consumption ones and you'll see huge variations. You look at John Barrett's work in Leeds and compare it to the Global Carbon Project, which is spread across a number of European countries, and you'll see about 25% difference in their consumption-based data. You go to look at the Swedish government data and it's different to both of those for Sweden. So big uncertainties. The second thing about it is the levers are different. The levers of policy are very different. The levers of policy for territorial emissions are really the ones that governments can pull. The levers for consumption-based emissions are often much softer and different. Now, there are things you could do, and I think perhaps we should consider this, and actually if we were in the EU, it would be much easier. Well, I think we could start to put controls on imports, that they have to have anything brought into the EU would have to have some sort of marker as to the level of CO2 emissions from it. And if it was above that level, it would not be permitted to be used. But then, of course, you come up against World Trade Organization rules on that. So that you have to play out the international laws on these things. But they're the sorts of levers you can play at best. Most of the other ones are really relatively indirect by trying to influence what consumers can buy. So unless you're going to have import tariffs of one sort or another, which I'm not completely against if they're purely based and used fairly on carbon, but you then have to, even there, you've got to have some consideration, because if you've got other parts of the world that are now manufacturing goods and selling them to the West, and then suddenly you put some carbon constraint on it, then those communities, they suddenly have no employment. So you then force them to suddenly be unemployed. Now, they may suffer all sorts of consequences from our perfectly reasonable, just assumptions about emissions over here. And so I think we have to be careful about these things as well. So a lot of uncertainty, a lot of knock-on implications we have to consider. Nevertheless, I think we should always use consumption-based emission estimates as a complement to territorial. And if our territorial emissions are coming down and our consumption estimate is that they're going up, then it probably is that we're offshoring our emissions to other parts of the world. So they work in tandem, in my view.
Yeah, And I suppose that uncertainty you're referring to is compounded by the fact that we've outsourced so much of our manufacturing industry.
We have. It depends which countries you look at. I mean, the US has outsourced much less. The UK, when we were a sort of bar and banking society, so we pretty much, as far as I can see, we've outsourced so much of it. But if you go to Germany, it's very different. Even France, and so yeah.
Yep. I think you can draw breath or take a swig, because I think the next two things were actually points that people have made. Dave Wells is saying that there's a meeting coming up in Glossop on the 29th of September. He's offering to send details about the climate and ecological emergency bill. In fact, Dave, I think I'm going to do that on your behalf anyway, because it's one of 2 or 3 things I'm going to post. Sorry, that was from Peter Allen. And Kevin will be talking. Kevin will be talking there. And the last point was actually somebody saying, oh no, that's right. Peter Allen's put a link for the climate and ecological bill in the chat function, those who wish to see it or to follow it up. And the last, and it's maybe a nice way to end, Kevin, is from David Smith, who's had to leave us. And he's basically extending his courtesies for a very interesting presentation and thanking us for the invite. David Smith is an officer of High Peak Council. He's one of the officers that we've been meeting with. Michael Corcoran, who's part of the audience here, will know David Smith. And so maybe we've just made a little inroad there. That I must say, on behalf of High Peak Council, said, do you, Sustainable Hayfield, want to use the council's communications team to promote this talk? And I went back and said, well, yes, of course, thank you. So maybe there's people turning in organizations of that kind. And we're grateful to David for attending and for making that comment.
Yes, and of course we need, I mean, local councils are absolutely key in driving a lot of change. I think we always think about decision makers at the sort of at the national level, but action is almost always implemented at the local level.
Yes.
And councils have been very important. The Bristol Airport was rejected by the Bristol Council, and it was the developer under pressure from the government that were forced to head the appeal.
Yeah. Well, David is the Climate and Communities Officer in High Peak Council, and he that's, I think, a new job designation, but he will be managing the climate change officer that the council is appointing. So
wonderful. That's good news.
That is good news.
Yeah.
And let's maybe end on that basis.
Yeah.
Kevin, can I say on behalf of us all, thank you very much indeed for another real tour de force, or tour d'horizon, as they say. You've taken us far and wide, and you also anchored us in some practical things that we can do for our part in our own lives, in discussion with our colleagues, with our families, with our friends, and also as agents for change in campaigning and in raising issues and in challenging established organizations on this existential and so important agenda. Thank you very much, Kevin, for joining us and speaking as you have.
And thanks for all the questions. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you to everybody who's participated as you have. I hope you've enjoyed this evening, and we'll see you again soon, I hope. Thank you very much, one and all.
Right.